Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're looking at another video from Impact Video Ministries. In this one, they claim to be taking an unbiased look at creation and evolution and seeing which one is a better explanation for the existence of life. They are doing this in terms that I am tempted to argue with. They're calling their video segment What Makes More Sense, which suggests that it's going to be based on an appeal to common sense. Common sense is not useful in science because common sense very frequently gives us the wrong answers. For instance, in statistics, common sense would tell us that if we just flipped a coin 5 times and got 5 heads in a row, it's more likely that tails will come up on the next flip. This is not the case. Each flip has a 50-50 chance for either result, independent of the previous flips. So after flipping 5 heads in a row, you still have a 50% chance of flipping a 6th head, even though intuitively we feel like it's just about time for tails to show up. In fact, flip a coin 6 times in a row, and it doesn't matter what combination of heads and tails results, they all had the same probability, 1 in 64, or 1.6%. This is counterintuitive because our brains like patterns, so we see a series that fits a pattern, like flipping 6 heads in a row, as being less likely. So if there have been 5 heads so far, odds are that the 6th flip will be tails, right? But it's wrong, because common sense essentially amounts to cognitive shortcuts that our brain takes to understand the world around us without having to waste too many resources on it. Science, as a methodology, is designed specifically to avoid allowing common sense to affect the results. So the whole premise of this video is that if he can present the two sides in a way that makes one seem more intuitive, then he wins and creation must be true. But by that reasoning, it's more likely that your 6th flip will be tails. But let's just see what he has to say.
Hi guys, my name is Johnny Lucas and we're going to be looking at a special video segment today called What Makes More Sense. We take a look at 2 opposing topics and evaluate them to see which one makes more sense. Simple, right?
Yeah, it is simple. If you don't care too much about how reality actually works and only want a flawed common sense understanding, sure.
So today we're going to be looking at the Bible's account of creation versus Darwin's evolutionary theory.
Why is it always Darwin's evolutionary theory? I mean, I get it, he's the guy who discovered the mechanism that made evolution make sense, but evolution, in one form or another, has been known for thousands of years, with its roots going back to ancient Greece and China, and continuing on through the Romans and the medieval Islamic sciences. Darwin discovered one of the main mechanisms for evolution, sure, but he did not develop the idea of evolution in general. Empedocles, the discoverer of air, back in the 400s BCE, was of the opinion that the first organisms would have been made out of the disjointed parts of the ones that we see today, and that everything turned out the way it did because the combination of these disjointed parts that were most suited to survival were the ones that survived. That actually comes pretty close to Darwinian evolution while still missing the mark by a long shot. So yeah, Darwin's discovery was groundbreaking, but as with all major scientific discoveries, he was standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before him. And actually I would be tempted to reword that statement to standing on the shoulders of fleas, who are themselves standing on the shoulders of other fleas, because scientific progress is made very slowly with very small discoveries adding up to a larger whole.
In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, it tells us that God created all of the living creatures on the face of the earth and in the sea and in the air, each according to its own kind.
Yes. Now let's examine the story a little bit closer, since we're using common sense as our judging tool for this exercise. It's not just that God created all of these creatures according to their kind. There's also the part where, if we are to take your branch of Christianity's view on the matter, he created an evil being who he knew would have the ability to mess up his perfect creation, and then he created a method for his perfect creation to be messed up in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He then created Adam and Eve without the knowledge of good and evil, and put them in the garden with a tree that they are not supposed to eat from, situated front and center, whose fruit was described as good for food and as a delight to the eyes. So he put people who didn't know the difference between good and evil in a garden with a lovely looking tree that would give them the knowledge of good and evil if they ate from it, and then he told them not to eat from it. Then he left them alone with this tree and a being who wants them to disobey God and knows how to get them to do it, and with them not being able to understand why they shouldn't disobey. He then punishes them for their disobedience. And not only punishes them, but punishes all of their descendants for all of time. Does this story make sense? Seriously, let's look at a basic analogy. That would be like me having a 2-year-old child, telling that child not to eat any candy while I'm out, and then hiring a babysitter who has a history of giving kids candy without asking permission first, and then not even bothering to tell the babysitter not to give the kids candy, and then punishing the kid when I get home and find out that he ate the candy that the babysitter gave him. Oh yeah, and did I mention that the parent in this scenario knows absolutely that the kid will eat the candy and is actually still home watching the babysitter give the kid candy while pretending not to be home? And the parent had the ability to hire a babysitter that would take proper care of the kid, and could have stepped in at any time to prevent it, and had the ability to make the kid understand the consequences of his actions, but chose not to. And now, because this kid ate the candy, the kid goes on a timeout. But that's not all. His kids are also on a timeout for their whole lives, too, as are his grandkids, and so on, forever. Because this one kid, who didn't know any better, ate the candy that the adult made enticing and convenient to him.
It also tells us that God created the very first man and woman to walk this earth. They were able to walk and talk and plan from the very beginning, and the first commandment that God gave them was to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So that's essentially how mankind and all the creatures on the earth got their start according to the Bible.
Yeah, that's a bit of a rocky start. Especially if we are to believe that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. Maybe next time don't make snakes. Or Satan. Or magic trees that are designed to trick people into eating from them.
So now let's look at the evolutionary theory. It stems from the 1859 book titled The Origin of Species by author Charles Darwin, who was also a naturalist and a biologist.
That's where the mechanism of natural selection is fleshed out, and that might be the first time anyone has suggested that all species have one shared origin. But as pointed out earlier, evolution itself did not originate with Darwin.
It holds the premise that every single living organism on the planet are all related and that we've all descended from one single and very simple common ancestor.
That's it in a nutshell, yeah. In a bit more detail, it's that we observe that there are differences between generations of organisms, and that sometimes these differences will have an effect on whether or not those organisms survive long enough to reproduce. The changes that help the organism to survive to reproduction will tend to accumulate in the gene pool, and as populations are reproductively isolated from each other, there will be accumulations of different changes. Over time, this means that the two different isolated groups will slowly change in different ways, resulting in slightly different species. We can see this happening today. Kids are different from their parents. But we can look back through time with this as well. The organisms that most closely resemble each other tend to be more closely related than those who do not. And so here I am going to be comparing morphology with genetics, morphology being the actual physical appearance of an organism, and genetics being the comparison of the organism's DNA. So when we put together a family tree of organisms that look similar, we can analyze their DNA to see how accurate this family tree is, and we usually find that it's pretty accurate, though in disagreements with methods, genetics will typically trump morphology as it is the more reliable method of the two for determining relationships. This actually creates a bit of a feedback loop. We check our morphology-based phylogenies against the genetic phylogenies and use the results to refine our methods for determining relationships through morphology. So by examining the relationships between organisms using both morphological and genetic methods, we can figure out how the relationships extend into the past. And what we see is organisms getting less complex and less specialized the further back in time you go, until all you have are single-celled organisms for the first 3 billion years of Earth's history.
It proposes that over time, more complex genetic mutations occur to benefit the survival of a given organism, and those organisms without genetic advantages will die off. This is known as natural selection.
Kinda. Although additional complexity is not required, it is expected. The mutations that natural selection works on are essentially random, and there is no end goal for the evolutionary process, so it would actually be rather surprising if there weren't a great deal of needless complexity. Because mutations can only work on genes that are already there. There is no optimization mutation that will cut out anything superfluous. So with random changes working on material that is already present to build up new things, you would expect a general increase in the amount of complexity.
And this is how you would slowly get diverging in various species over time.
Yeah. Kids are different from their parents. Different kids are different in different ways, and if those different kids live in different environments, their different differences become more different. As the different differences differentiate, different species emerge, and in billions of years, you get an amazing amount of diversity, or differences.
He offered up this illustration known as the tree of life. So now that we briefly defined the creation account and the evolutionary process, let's evaluate them and see which one makes more sense.
Well, At this point, and I know this is going to be a shocker for you, so hold on, but I'm kinda leaning toward evolution making more sense. It seems to fit nicely with several different observed phenomena, while creation sounds like third-rate fantasy. Now don't get me wrong here, I would like to acknowledge that there is some amazing literature in the Bible when it's taken in its cultural and historical context. Genesis 1 is one of the best surviving examples of Hebrew high poetry. But if we're stripping away cultural and historical context and insisting on reading it as a literal historical document, it reads like a poorly thought out fantasy novel. So please, if you take nothing else away from this video, remember this. Insisting on a young earth creationist interpretation of the Bible strips the Bible of its literary beauty and leaves it in the company of authors whose books end up on the table in the library full of books that they give away for free because nobody ever checks them out and they need to make space for better books.
All right. So what we're going to do is use some scientific principles, and we're going to pose the same questions for each subject. All right, question number 1. What are the core contrasting differences between the biblical creation account for life on Earth and Darwin's evolutionary theory for life on Earth?
I assume you mean the diversification of life on Earth on the Darwin side, because evolution doesn't handle the ultimate origin of life. So I'd say one core difference there is that Darwin's evolutionary theory, by which I'm just going to assume you mean the theory of evolution as it is understood today, doesn't have an account for the origin of life on Earth. The biblical account certainly does. A disembodied spirit made a man out of dirt and breathed on his face to make him alive. Then he put him to sleep and ripped out one of his ribs to turn into a woman. So one reads like an ancient ideological myth, and the other one does a good job of explaining why life is so diverse but doesn't touch on its origins. Those are the main contrasting differences that I see.
The Bible claims that all life on this planet was created at one moment in time by an all-powerful, intelligent God, whereas evolution claims that the life forms on this planet are the result of a series of successive genetic mutations that resulted into the life forms that we see today.
Right, so creation says that life is the result of a process that we have never seen and wouldn't even know how to go about testing, while evolution says that the diversity of life is the result of a process that has been known about for thousands of years and is very well documented.
What evolution fails to yield in contrast to the creation account is the origin of life.
Yep. You sure are right that the theory that doesn't even attempt to explain the origin of life doesn't explain the origin of life. Well done. Gold star.
If we are indeed descendants from simple single-celled organisms, how did these organisms come into being?
Good question. Excellent question, in fact. And the answer is that we don't really know yet. We may never know for sure. But ultimately, it doesn't matter to the theory of evolution that we don't know where the first organism came from. All that matters is that the first organism did show up at some point. And at that point, evolution and natural selection went to work on what was already there to improve it and specialize it into different environments. Would you like to posit God as the explanation for the origin of the first organism? Sure, go ahead. Just bear in mind that not knowing the answer to a question doesn't make your answer the correct one.
It's a question that must be addressed if you're going to hold on to the evolutionary theory as a belief.
Not at all. There are plenty of people out there who accept the theory of evolution, but believe that God, in one form or another, got life started. In fact, at this point, I'll direct your attention to BioLogos, an organization whose whole existence is devoted to helping Christians understand how a science-based view of reality does not conflict with their faith. They definitely accept the theory of evolution, but the fact that the origin of life is not fully explained does not bother them at all. And, unlike most creationist organizations, they allow for diversity of opinion on the matter. Some of these evolutionary creationists, which is the term they coined for themselves, do propose a miraculous creation event for the origin of life. Others do not. They take the position of believing that God designed the universe, so we should study the universe to figure out what natural processes God used when doing his designing. So while they are not saying that the question doesn't need to be addressed, and just to be clear, neither was I, but the answer to that question is independent from the question of evolution. To go back to my Lego analogy from a previous video, if you're building the Saturn V Lego set, how you go about building that set is not dependent on the manufacturing method used to make the bricks. Yes, the manufacturing needs to have happened first, but you can build the set without any knowledge about how the manufacturing takes place.
In 1952, a Jewish-American chemist named Stanley Miller conducted what was called the Origin of Life experiment.
Nope, gonna stop you right there. It was not called the Origin of Life experiment. It was called a production of amino acids under possible primitive Earth conditions. This is an important distinction, as you will soon see.
The experiment sought to see if microscopic life forms could be produced by recreating Earth's early atmosphere using a series of gases that were thought to have been the atmosphere's composition at that time.
Now let's read the title of the paper again. A production of amino acids under possible primitive Earth conditions. What part of that suggests that it was an attempt to produce microscopic life? In no way were they trying to produce actual life. They were checking to see if amino acids could form in the environment that they thought would have been the prebiotic Earth environment.
The gases included hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water vapor. These substances were put within a sterile glass container, and the contents were sparked with electrical discharges to simulate lightning. After 5 days, Miller discovered that a few simple amino acids had collected at the bottom of the glass. The experiment was seen as a success at the time.
Yes, it was, and still is, seen as a success. Now, if all that were produced were amino acids, why would they see that as a success if they were going for actual microscopic life? They got amino acids from an environment that could have existed on the early Earth. The formation of amino acids is an important step on the way to development of the first life. So, what part of this was a failure exactly?
But it was later discredited because further scientific analysis over the years led the scientific community to believe that the Earth's early atmosphere was actually made up of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water.
So you're saying the whole experiment was discredited because they got the composition of the early atmosphere wrong? Sorry, but no, that's not how it works. Firstly, it is possible that environments similar to the one simulated in the experiment would have existed on the early Earth near volcanoes. Just because it wasn't the whole Earth doesn't make the experiment a failure. Secondly, the only thing the experiment set out to do was to demonstrate that amino acids could form naturally, and it did that. So it was, and remains to this day, a success. Also, I don't think you even mentioned this, but one of the common creationist complaints about the Miller-Urey experiment is that they had to remove the amino acids from the experiment before they degraded, as they wouldn't remain stable in the environment. Well, in 2008, scientists re-examined the original vials from the experiment that had been sealed for the entire time, and found even more amino acids than Miller and Urey were able to find. Now, don't get too excited. These weren't new acids that evolved in the intervening time. It's just that our ability to detect amino acids has become that much more refined. But this does demonstrate that the amino acids could stick around and accumulate.
Which is what volcanic gases were producing. The experiment was performed again using these substances, and no amino acids were produced.
This is another one of those times when it would be good if creationists would just, cite their sources. I don't even know what you're talking about here. I do know that within the last 20 years, much progress has been made in this field of study, and some research has suggested that the environment on the early Earth would have been even more favorable toward the development of organic molecules than the environment simulated in the Miller-Urey experiment. And that's not to mention the fact that we found amino acids and ribose sugars on meteorites, suggesting that even if the entire early Earth was completely hostile to the formation of these molecules, it could have happened elsewhere and arrived on the Earth via meteor strikes. What it comes down to is that all the compounds that make up life as we know it are known to form naturally. We're just not quite sure how they all came together.
But more importantly, neither experiment was able to produce life.
Why is that more importantly? To the best of my knowledge, there has not been an experiment yet with the goal of actually producing life from prebiotic conditions. Why would it be important that an experiment was unable to show a result that it wasn't even trying to show? I'm going to mix baking soda and vinegar. If the experiment is successful, it will bubble up. If unsuccessful, nothing will happen. Okay, it bubbled up. The experiment was a success. Yay! Yeah, but did it make elephant toothpaste? No. Why would that be relevant?
And sure, it's one thing to be able to create amino acids, which can be considered the building blocks of life, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to create life itself.
Correct. I agree. But if you're trying to demonstrate that it is possible for walls to be built, demonstrating that bricks can be made is an important first step. So why are you complaining that the demonstration that it is possible to make bricks didn't result in a fully built wall?
Just because you have a couple of bricks doesn't mean that you have a building. In fact, you could even take a living cell, cut it open, and put all of its contents into a sterile environment, and you still wouldn't be able to create life within it.
Well, that's not entirely true. There have been several experiments that have designed organisms by repurposing material from other organisms. The latest development in this type of research are the xenobots, cellular robots that are designed by a supercomputer and made out of frog stem cells. They modify the stem cells to form completely new, never-before-seen-in-nature structures to perform novel tasks. There have been other experiments where we redesigned an organism's genetic code, and even one where we developed a new set of base pairs to use in the genetic code. But my understanding is that creationists don't usually consider these groundbreaking experiments to be anything special because they are not trying to demonstrate abiogenesis. They are usually trying to repurpose microorganisms for some end goal, like metabolizing toxic waste. And as such, they are not trying to replicate the early Earth environments, they're just trying to make it work. So the creationists cry, "But that's intelligent design!" as if anyone were trying to use these experiments to prove abiogenesis. So you're wrong, and it doesn't matter. Yay?
Meaning that it's not enough to just have the proper building blocks in place, you still need a life force in order for an organism to enter into the state of living or being alive.
I'm gonna need you to provide some evidence for that claim, especially since it seems to hinge on your previous point being correct and you were wrong on that point. Can you provide any evidence or sources or citations or anything that such a life force even exists?
And thus we have the scientific observation known as biogenesis, which states that any new living organism can only be created from an already pre-existing living organism.
I think you've got this a bit backward. Biogenesis is the refutation of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation was the idea that all life had a life force, and this life force would leak out when an organism died, and would result in the production of new complex life, like maggots and mold. So if you want to suggest that we can't make life in a lab because we don't have access to this mysterious life force, then you can't have biogenesis on your side. And it bears mentioning that biogenesis applies to complex life. It says nothing about the origin of life.
So while the God of the Bible claims to be living and the sole progenitor for all life on earth, the theory of evolution does not offer any basis for how the first life forms came into being.
Again, it doesn't even try to. And again, just because you have an answer does not make that the correct answer. I could just as easily propose a life-creating, all-powerful, immortal hippogriff, and that is just as good an answer. Let's say that a math teacher just asked two students what the square root of 248 is. One student says, "I don't know." The other student says, 27. Does the one who confidently answered 27 get full marks because they were able to answer the question? Having the ability to answer when someone else says "I don't know" does not make your answer correct. And just to save you the work, it's 15.859126859. Or is it? Maybe I'm just assuming that you'll accept my answer as correct because I was the only one here who gave an answer.
And since we're searching for answers to events that have happened ages ago and are long since past, let's see whether creation or evolution makes more sense in the light of paleontology. So according to Darwin's Tree of Life illustration, in our fossil record, we should be able to find fossils of similar form and structure, gradually branching out and turning into the more complex and varied skeletal structures representative of the vast amount of creatures we see today, with the oldest skeletons looking very simple.
And that's exactly what we do see. For more detail, I highly recommend Aaron Ra's Systematic Classification of Life video series, where he traces what we know of human lineage through the fossil record all the way back to what would have been the first eukaryotic organisms. He gives great detail about why the specimens he selected were good representatives of each particular transitions, and lists several other lines of descent that branched off in other directions. As of this writing, he's on video 48 of the series, and it looks like it might be wrapping up soon. For now, let me just say that we have nothing but very simple single-celled organisms for the first 3 or so billion years of life on Earth, with a gradual progression toward the complexity that we see today.
And according to the Bible's creation account, in our fossil records, we should be able to find a vast variety of skeletal structures fully developed and appearing all within a short instance of each other.
I wonder if you're going to bring up the Cambrian explosion here. Nah, that definitely isn't where you're going with this. Creationists have been told over and over again that the Cambrian explosion was a process that took tens of millions of years, so only counts as sudden or an explosion if you're considering geologic timescales of billions of years. So surely you're not about to rehash that old argument. You must be about to bring up something new.
With the oldest ones being similar in structure and complexity as the present ones. So what do we actually find in our fossil record, you ask? Well, our fossil records indicate that about 543 million years ago, there was an appearance of nearly every major living animal body plan in our fossil record. This is referred to as the Cambrian explosion. In other words, almost 543 million years ago, fully grown and developed animals were suddenly present on Earth's surface. much of them looking just as they do today.
That is a flat-out lie. Your drawing there is indicative of a small primate. Find me a primate in the Cambrian. I dare you. If you can find me a confirmed primate that has been dated to the Cambrian, I'll give you $50. Not joking, I will seriously send you money if you can point out one primate from the Cambrian. Actually, I'll go even farther than that. Find me a mammal. Just one Cambrian mammal. Any mammal. Only catch is it has to be independently verified, and I have to be able to check on it. Should I extend that to reptiles? Because you won't find any of them in there either. No, what you find is that most of the major body plans showed up in the Cambrian explosion. So that's where the first vertebrates developed, for example. This guy, this weird-looking fish thing that doesn't look anything like anything that's alive today, represents the origin of the vertebrates. So everything with a backbone is represented by this guy. Also, I wonder why creationists never bring up the Great Ordovician biodiversification event, which was the largest biodiversification event that we know of in Earth's history, and it happened about 40 million years after the Cambrian explosion. Could it possibly be because it doesn't sound quite as much like special creation if the larger biodiversification event happened 40 million years after the first biodiversification event?
The Cambrian explosion spans a period of 20 million years and paints us a picture that looks less like a tree, as Darwin supposed, and more like individual blades of grass sprouting up on the surface.
There's actually more truth to this than this guy is probably aware of, but it's more to do with how the bacteria exchanged genetic material than because a god created everything right then. It's hard to trace ancestry when fully grown bacteria can swap genes with each other without reproducing. So the base of the tree of life might look more like a banyan tree than a typical single-trunked tree. But yeah, that's because microbes are weird, not because everything was created magically 6,000 years ago. So you're partially correct, but not for the reason you think you are.
So, put plainly, the bottom part of Darwin's tree of life does not exist in our fossil record.
What of the billions of years worth of bacterial fossils that we have? Followed by diversification in the Cambrian explosion to slightly more complex but still relatively simple forms. Followed by still more diversification into still more complex forms. Sorry, but it looks more and more like evolution is winning this fight. I mean, sure, you presented it in a way that would leave you the winner if you were right, but you're not right.
Meaning that from a paleontological standpoint, the Bible still makes more sense than evolution.
Not really. Even if I granted everything you said as being true, that means that God made all the major phyla some 540 million years ago and then allowed evolution to take over from there. Well, that's it for today. He goes on for a bit longer, he brings up irreducible complexity, and surprise, surprise, he compares the flagellar motor to a mousetrap. I mean, I get it, creationists don't have any new arguments, but could they at least come up with new analogies and examples? Today's comment of the day comes to us from a bunch of you. I commented last week on how gold doesn't have any intrinsic value. We value it for its qualities, but the gold in and of itself is not valuable just because it is gold.
I love gold!
And a bunch of you responded with different variations on the idea that gold is very useful in electronics for its conductive properties. And this is true, but its conductive properties don't make it inherently valuable. It was not valued for its conductive properties for thousands of years because we didn't even know it had conductive properties. We don't value the gold because it's gold. We value the gold because we value what it can do. It's still just a shiny rock. It was also suggested a couple times that it is valued for its rarity, which is at least partially true. But is rarity inherently valuable? No. Otherwise, astatine would be more valuable than gold. And I'm sure there are some scientists somewhere to whom it is more valuable than gold, but I imagine the vast majority of the population wouldn't have the slightest idea what to do with it. In order to make something valuable, rarity has to be combined with demand. If there is no demand for something, it doesn't matter how rare it is, it's not valuable. So, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to be notified when new videos go up. Thanks as always to my patrons, who are the yeast who makes the bread that is my channel rise. If you'd like to be the fungus that puffs me up, you can become a patron at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, and yes, I still do have my P.O. box if you want to send me stuff for whatever reason. See you next time.